Hello and welcome to this week's final edition of the Watchdog, coming to you live from our Auckland Park headquarters. My name is Vulinhle, and on the show tonight,
we have tightened up the bail laws. We have also tightened up sentences.
Government is engaging communities as the country continues its fight against gender-based violence. After hosting a community mbizo in Delft, Cape Town, the Deputy Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development joins us to talk about the initiative.
Another important role of Operation Vulinhle has been to provide a clear policy direction and ensure policy certainty.
Government has conceded that the majority of the reforms implemented under Operation Vulinhle are facing delays. Our panel of experts, developmental economists Lebohang Pegu and Pelisa Nkomo, are going to weigh in. The Watchdog starts now. Residents of Delft in Cape Town say they feel prejudiced by the police and the criminal justice system. According to South African Police Service Q3 crime statistics, Delft has recorded the highest number of sexual offences in the country. The Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Development held a community mbizo today to engage the residents about the ongoing fight against gender-based violence and femicide.
Amapolisa can do their work, I know this. But there's this problem, the making case. Most of the cases are settled.
A plea to the authorities for justice. The mbizo got heated as community members raised concerns about the high numbers of violent crimes, child abuse, and the early release of criminals. Residents say they are being failed by authorities.
Whenever a crime is being reported, you take your time to come out. The third point is to have an IPD official that must be stationed here in Delft at least once, if the schedule cannot allow, in every week, so that they can witness and monitor the mistreatment and disservice that is happening in our Delft police station.
I see a lot of gang, drugs and theft, and especially now, the past few days, past few weeks that's been going on, it's cable theft, and it's a lot, it's child abuse, it's child molesting.
The mbizo was hosted in partnership with justice stakeholders such as the National Prosecuting Authority, the Office of the Chief Justice, and Legal Aid SA. The Justice Ministry says more stringent measures are being put in place.
We have changed the law to put the onus on the accused in serious cases to show why they must be given bail, rather than for the state to be responsible for proving that they must not be given bail. So we have tightened up the bail laws. We have also tightened up sentences. We've got minimum sentences basically, and we keep increasing those number of crimes. But each case has to be judged on its own merits.
Residents have appealed to all stakeholders and law enforcement officials to interact with people daily.
Well, to discuss those issues further, we're now joined by the Deputy Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development, John Jeffrey. Good evening, Deputy Minister. Thanks very much for your time.
Good evening, Vuyo. Good evening to the viewers.
Now, you have launched this community program, and you are, what exactly are you trying to achieve with this initiative?
Well, it's actually wasn't the launch, it's the second one. Last week, Minister Lomola...
Well, I meant to say you launched it recently, of course, this being...
Yes. He had one in Carolina last week, so this is really the second one. But it's going out to communities, to listen to communities, to hear from them their concerns, and then also to raise issues with them specifically on gender-based violence. So it's a two-way process. But the aim is to engage with communities. We also, at the end of the meeting, I had said that more work needs to be done. We need to engage with community-based organizations in the area to take the issues of concern further.
Your choices, I mean, your choice of places to go to, is there like a particular criteria that you use to determine which places to go to?
With Delft, it was specifically the statistics that you gave some of them on. Delft is 7th on the top 30 SAP stations with the highest number of contact crimes. Number 2 on the top 30 when it comes to murder, 3rd highest on sexual offences and the highest in the Western Cape, 4th on the list for rape and the highest in the Western Cape. So it was basically the issues of the large numbers of serious crimes that are taking place in the area. The Thuthuzela Care Centre, which covers Delft, which is in Belleville, I think has the highest figures in the country even, not just the Western Cape.
Now, listening to the people who were speaking there, they don't seem to have a great deal of trust in the system. That should worry you.
No, it does. A lot of the complaints were about the police, because that's, I think, where most ordinary people have contact with the criminal justice system. So it was complaints about the police, complaints about social development. The ones on justice were issues of bail. You'd mentioned the issue of parole. And there was a question, a sort of converse question about a person wanting to get criminal records expunged, which is, in a sense, the counter to people complaining about sentenced prisoners coming out earlier on parole. Those were the kinds of questions really linked to justice. But as you said, we had a large number. We had the acting chief magistrate of Belleville also addressed the community, the provincial director of public prosecutions, along with the police, health, social development, correctional services.
How do you think that helps, bringing all, these people under one roof and getting people to interact directly with them? What do you think that achieves?
Well, the idea is, I mean, in the criminal justice system particularly, there's many role players, many actors, and they've all got to work together. So it's basically the police detectives, the police stations where crimes are reported, the prosecutors, the magistrates, legal aid because they represent a number of the accused, and then obviously also health and social workers. So the idea of bringing them all together is largely so that all questions can be answered, and you've got somebody with specific details. One of the complaints was around the limited number, or the fact that there wasn't a Thuthuzela Care Centre in Delft. The nearest one is at Karl Bremer in Belleville. But there are only 4 Thuthuzela Care Centres in the Cape Town Metro. However, the Provincial Director of Public Prosecutions was able to say that 2 more, the NPA is wanting to establish 2 more Thuthuzela Care Centres in the Cape Town Metro. So, you have that information from the officials who know.
Now, in that insert we just played, you mention how you have changed laws around sentencing, for example. Any thoughts about, are you having any conversations, perhaps behind the scenes, about possibly looking at tampering with the laws when it comes to, such issues as bail and parole, which people there were complaining about?
Yeah, look, we've just changed the laws. They've still got to come into final effect. There were the 3 gender-based violence bills that Parliament passed last year and the President signed into law this year. Regulations for each of those laws have to be drawn up, and the department is quite close to completing its work on the regulations. So they will then come into effect. And those laws make changes to the Sexual Offences Act, they tighten bail laws, they increase sentences, and they also do improvements to the Domestic Violence Act. However, it's not just an issue of tightening the laws, it's also ensuring that those laws are enforced, that everybody in the system does what they're meant to do, they don't turn people away, those kinds of things. But gender-based violence is also a societal crime. It's not like, as I raised in the meeting, you've got a group of pickpocketers who hang out around the corner from a mall or a supermarket, that you know where they hang out, you know what they look like, and you know how that you should avoid them. It's a crime committed by men in South Africa. You and me are men. It's people's fathers, grandfathers, uncles, brothers, sons. And so we've got to find a way of dealing with it as society as a whole. This toxic masculinity that gives rise to men assaulting women. Let me also just say that gender-based violence isn't, it's gender neutral, as it were. It's not just women being the victims and men being the aggressors. You can have men being assaulted and even killed by their partners, their female partners. But that is actually quite a small, very small percentage of the total number of gender-based violence cases. So when we talk about gender-based violence, we're more talking about a problem of what men are doing to women.
Mm-hmm. Of course, I mean, tightening the laws is one thing, and having a strategic plan that everybody agrees, is what we needed. I mean, those things would need implementation at the end of the day. How far have you gone towards ensuring that your police, for example, are actually trained, and understand the kind of ethos that is required of them in order to be able to make a difference?
A lot of work has been put into training the police and ensuring that there are gender-based violence sensitive rooms that people can make their statements, can go and report their cases. So a lot is being done. The problem is that things are being implemented by human beings, and often human beings make mistakes or have their own prejudices or own views. And it's important that when that happens, whether it's a police person, whether it's a court official, whether it's a prosecutor, or even a magistrate, that needs to be reported and taken up so that action can be taken, corrective action. And obviously one needs the details of the person who, for example, sent a woman home who came to report an assault at the police station and told her to go and sort it out at home. Mm. We need the name of that person, or at least a description of them, what time they were on duty, that kind of thing, so it can be taken up with them.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts about where you taking this campaign next, where you're going next?
Look, there'll be further campaigns. I'm not sure the details of what is planned next, but we need to, well, it's a number of issues. We need to engage with communities. We need to inform them of their rights and the processes that they can follow, the things that government is providing as far as gender-based violence. We need to educate people on that. We also then need to listen and be able to respond to their questions. One of the other concerns from Delft, I'd mentioned it as far as the Tutuzela care centers are concerned, but it basically was issues of insufficient resources in Delft. They would like to have a court where they can have domestic violence cases heard. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we've got to look at that in the overall context of the needs of the province or the city, the province and the country as a whole. But it's the second part is engaging with people, but then it's also taking it further to ensure that where there are problems, they are corrected. But it's also to encourage communities to also look at programs, implementing their own programs to deal with gender-based violence and to deal with issues of toxic masculinity, caring for the boy child, who should have role models to know how he should behave when he is an adult, it's issues. It's a number of issues like that.
Mm-hmm. But were there issues raised there that perhaps you were not aware of, or you were hearing for the first time?
Look, I think it's always important to hear from communities. Let me be honest, I wasn't aware of but wasn't surprised about the complaints of lack of resources that were raised there. But as I said, the problem is being able to spread things. Generally, it was I think reasserting, but with more detail and more specifics, problems that one was already aware of. But it was good to hear it from the horse's mouth, as it were, from the people themselves.
Okay, and that's where we're going to leave it. Thank you very much for your time this evening, the Deputy Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development, on the back of a community imbizo that they had today, where they are raising awareness, but also a meeting with communities and explaining to them how the law works, but also hearing their complaints and, of course, recommendations as well. Up next, we'll look at Operation Vulinhle. The government today said they have completed 8 of the 19 priority reforms that were identified. Our panel looks at whether indeed there has been as much progress as the government says there has been. That's coming up next on the Watchdog. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana says they have completed 8 of the 19 priority reforms identified by Operation Vulinhle. Operation Vulinhle is a joint initiative of the Presidency and National Treasury to accelerate the implementation of structural reforms and support economic recovery. It reports directly to President Cyril Ramaphosa. SABC reporter Zoleka Kodashe compiled this report.
Established in October 2020, Operation Vulinhle is said to have made significant gains. These include the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa's success in concluding the high-demand radio spectrum auction in March after a 10-year delay. The process raised billions for the fiscus.
These reforms are already bearing fruit. In digital communication, the successful allocation of high-demand spectrum not only raised more than 8 billion rand for the fiscus, recent estimates suggest that the industry will invest over 50 billion in transport. The successful implementation of third-party access to the freight rail network can spare an additional investment of 58 billion rand.
The progress report on the work of Operation Vulinhle for the first quarter of 2020 was released earlier this week. And in his weekly newsletter, President Cyril Ramaphosa hailed the establishment of the National Ports Authority and the reinstatement of the Blue Drop, Green Drop and No Drop systems.
We've also revived various water quality monitoring systems. So we've had the Green Drop report published recently for the first time since 2014. This allows for better monitoring of water and wastewater treatment quality. It allows for greater accountability and allows for government to assess where municipalities may need support in implementing and improving water quality. The revised critical skills list has been published for the first time since 2014. This allows us to reflect the current skills shortages in the economy and, where necessary, allows businesses to attract these skills from outside the country in the short term.
Despite this, the implementation of some projects has been challenging. Treasury says they have completed 8 out of the 19 reforms and are experiencing obstacles in the implementation of 11 reforms, particularly in the energy sector.
And there are 2 where there are some critical challenges in implementation. Unfortunately, these are 2 in the energy sphere, and we know that this is having a particularly negative impact on our economy. These are 2 where we are redoubling efforts to make sure that we can see the full impact of these reforms being realized.
Operation Vulinhle also aims to reform the visa regime to attract skills and promote tourism growth. Government says this will place South Africa on a new trajectory of high and sustainable growth. Zoleka Kotashe, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, we're now joined by Senior Research Fellow and Political Economist Lebohang Pheko and Developmental Economist and Oxfam Chairperson Pelisa Nkomo. Good evening to both of you and thank you so much for your time.
Hi, good evening to you. Good evening to the listeners.
Let me start with you, Pelisa. The reforms are already bearing fruit, according to the finance minister. But 8 out of 19 reforms are completed. Does that sound like progress to you?
Well, I mean, at first value, they do sound like progress. But perhaps let's just talk about even the political economics of these reforms, by the way, right? So if you look at the structure of all these political reforms, in fact, they're about creating a space for the private sector to actually enter the space unto which government used to provide services. So there is a privatization agenda here, but it's coming out quite slow. That's the first issue. I think the second issue is that when we talk about structural reform, I mean, for me, this is really what at first value again will be described as public policy failures, which I don't think that most of them actually are public policy failures, but they're actually linked to the fact that they are the government needs to beef up its current expertise to make it sure that it delivers. I think the third issue, which for me is actually quite scary about these structural reforms, is that actually it indicates that the private sector in this country is not actually willing to do the actual structural reform that you require. And let me make a simple example, for instance. You know, South Africa has actually protected ArcelorMittal in terms of steel production in the name of security of supply. But we're not able to manufacture anything outside of the primary steel that gets manufactured. For me, that's where structural reform sits, because in essence, through the participation of various firms within the South African economy, within the value chain of steel industry. Actually, that's where structural reform is, because then that's where you need to introduce industrial development, but also technology to make it sure that we don't import finished goods. So currently we do import those goods. So I do think this is just couched under structural reform, but really I think the package is about privatizing services whom under normal circumstances would have been provided by the state. For example, one area that I think I welcome is around the blue drop report, which I think I know that we've been seeing videos around the quality of water, that we've been receiving. But I do think that, I mean, the rest, in fact, even when you talk about skills, I mean, look at the amount of money that we're pouring within sectors, right, for skills. Why do we still continue to have structural skills mismatch in the economy? What's going on in between our human capital strategy as a country, the throughput that is coming out from universities and FET colleges, and our industrial economy? So for how long are we going to be talking about special visas, skills mismatch, etc.? And I do think that if we don't find that connect within the system, we will then continue to actually open up, by the way, all this visa system, and in fact, all the jobs in this country will be taken up by people whom under, disguise of critical skills. I went through in preparation of this interview. I went through the critical skills report. Well, I mean, there are areas where I don't think I agree, but I think there are areas where I think we do need the skills. But the key question is, what type of shadowing approach so that we know that in the next 5 to 10 years, we won't be talking about critical skills. In fact, we'll know that South Africans are actually able to provide the services that are required in the economy, and they have the sufficient skills. Okay,
and we are going to get into some of those, the areas you've mentioned in a while. But let me come to you, Lebohang, considering the fact that in October, it'll be 2 years since Operation Vulinhle was launched. Do you consider this progress. I mean, the fact that government is patting itself in the back, do you think they are justified?
So, I mean, that's an interesting question. Remember that it also comes in the light of some of the COVID recovery economic plans that were also put into place, and that Operation Vulinhle is an attempt to consolidate and solve several problems concurrently. So issues around the digital economy, issues around Eskom, issues around water purification, as Philisa has already mentioned, the ICT sector, the visa issue in very broad strokes. I do think that it is things take time and change takes time, but I think that broadly speaking, it is very difficult to speak about success unless we are measuring merely on the basis of things having been ticked off. But I think substantive success that is ground up and based on community experiences is really what is perhaps what is the key issue and the key component. And I think that certainly when we think about the monitoring and evaluation mechanisms that are in place to ensure that and to enable these successes to be measured and felt, they do take time. I mean, the other piece of this is that, of course, what is the objective of Operation Vulinhle? What are the questions that it is seeking to answer, and what are the problems that it's seeking to solve? It's a myriad of a conglomeration of several questions and several challenges that have been besetting. So the one, of course, being Eskom, which is still in a considerable amount of debt to the tune of about 392 billion rands at last count, and that's about 8% of South Africa's GDP. It is extremely significant. And another piece of that is that, and you know, we've been reading about ratings agencies whom I personally don't rate very highly, but they have been using this as a justification for the very low investment grades that we've been receiving. Another piece of that is also around digitization, the digital economy, and increasing broad available spectrum. And the logic for this is that this migration from analog to digital TV could potentially open up the sector to much greater investment, and these auctions, this spectrum broadband auctions that are also taking place. So the whole logic of this is that different media and different signals are then going to be made available, and that this is going to democratize access to different forms of digital media. And this is really an old conversation, Vuyo, and the viewers and Philisa, that we've been hearing about the digital divide for over 20 years, 25 years. And I've spoken a lot previously on this program around how digital democracy is such a key part of knowledge creation, it's such a key part of education, it's such a key part of productivity and creativity. But what we are seeing at the moment is, I think, a list of undertakings, but I am cautious about whether we can call them successes or whether we can call them valiant attempts to solve very long-standing problems.
Let's start with Eskom, because last week I had an interview with the Minister of Finance, who said that there was a plan to deal with Eskom's debt, which, as everyone knows, is quite huge, and you've just mentioned that. Where he says there's an even bigger problem is how Eskom is run. He wasn't happy with how Eskom is being run currently, Philisa.
Well, it will be interesting actually to hear from him exactly what is the source of discomfort from his side. But I think as ordinary citizens, we do experience that there's absolutely something wrong with Eskom. One of the things, for example, is the fact that the debt of Eskom has been on the rise. I think the second issue, I do think that Eskom is one of the oldest institutions, utilities in South Africa and in the world. And in essence, there is an opportunity, for instance, to make it sure that Eskom, with the renewable program that is in place, that to integrate Eskom within that renewable program. Now, if, for instance, the ministers who are meant to be shareholders are just uncomfortable, only they express displeasure in public, but there's very little that they're actually doing in relation to how Eskom should really be positioning. We saw some of the structural reforms which are in the report. They're introducing around unbundling Eskom. Some of us do differ with the unbundling because we think that Eskom has a massive role, but also we think that the issue that needs to be addressed is capacity internally, which I would have really liked him to say capacity within Eskom, but also at the same time is the issue around corruption. I think it's coming out quite clear, the fact that Eskom gets overcharged, for several services, but also inside the system, there's also, corruption that Eskom has not been able to actually uproot, and then let alone the issues of debt. The last point I want to make around Eskom, we do see the misnomer within the IPP program as well as Eskom. One would expect, for example, that Eskom become the shareholder in all these IPP programs, so that if you move to a just transition to deal with issues of climate change and fossil fuel, but also reducing emission, is that actually Eskom would be part of not only investing in infrastructure, technological infrastructure, which is related with renewable energy, but also you are able to keep existing capacity of almost about 40,000 workers, whom the bigger portion of it, by the way, is actually engineers. Yes, it is possible that Eskom actually might be also sitting with a massive workforce, which, that's one of the things we need to interrogate and say, if we continue to have load shedding, why are we still sitting with so much workers? And there's at the tail end, we, as citizens, we're experiencing load shedding, but also at the same time is that the economy as well will be badly affected in terms of productivity due to load shedding.
In fact, it would seem that skills is a big part of the problem. Only this week, the head of generation, it was announced, is leaving Eskom. And I heard the minister yesterday or the day before talking about how very experienced Eskom people have actually left the country, some of them, and they are being snapped by other countries. But Lebohang, there is something that from the presentations today, there's a bold claim that is being made, and I'm going to read a line. It says, in a few years' time, energy reforms will mean that there is competition in electricity generation with adequate supply to meet demand and no more load shedding. An independent grid operator will buy electricity at the lowest price from Eskom and private generators. Are you convinced that this indeed is what we're going to see in the next few years?
So, I think over the next, this comes on the back of several different debates. I think the one is the whole energy crisis and the links to that and the transition to different forms of energy in any case. And the transition away from carbon energy. So this really needs to be located and situated between a much broader energy crisis and energy poverty that we experience in this country. For some of the reasons that Phyllis has already mentioned as well, that we need to be really rethinking the way that our state-owned enterprises at large, because I think that this is also a call to solve many problems that many of our state-owned enterprises have, how they are functioning in the first place, and whether the shareholder model that we have at the moment, so the internal-external balance that SOEs have to strike, is really the one that is going to maximize both efficiency and effectiveness, but also speak to us as a social developmental state, and one that is really steeped in trying to solve problems of intergenerational poverty, intergenerational lack of access. So there's energy poverty in this country, there's land poverty in this country, there's digital poverty in this country. So the layers of our poverty are very complex and multifaceted and multi-layered. And what are the sort of the purpose-driven energy complexes that we need to think about? And as much as I don't want us to be looking at what they do in New Zealand or what they're doing in different countries. I do think that it is very useful for us to look at countries in the global south and developing economies in the global south for some kind of inspiration, such as China, such as, for example, some of the Venezuelan and Brazilian examples, and how they're trying very much to bring their large populations who have historically been energy poor and still very energy poor into the matrix. Vietnam at the moment, for example, is also over the last few years has been experimenting with a well-being economy model, which measures things such as access to electricity as an indice. and as a measure of success. And perhaps we could be thinking around those sorts of lines, around tangible measures to say X amount of homes by this time should have access to electricity, should have access to sanitation, should have access to digital platforms, cheaply, by the way, so that then we're able to then build a matrix. I think the problem, one of the issues that we're trying to solve many problems in silos, and yet an integrative approach is possibly one that might be of some value to us.
Well, in addition to, electricity problems, we have water problems as well. I mean, in the KZN South Coast, for example, they have been battling, they are having serious water challenges, and it's been going on for about 3 years now. In fact, right now, as we speak, the 750,000 or so residents of that area are experiencing very serious water shortages. Water goes there in tanks and all of that stuff. And from what was said today, the government seems optimistic that they are on top of it and they are dealing with the problem, Pelisa.
No, I don't think the government is on top of it when it comes to water. General, I think the first issue is that South Africa is a water scarce country. So you're not going to be able to be on top of it. I think that's the first issue. So the key issue is to then say, what are the things that you need to do in an innovative way to make sure that you increase, access to water? Firstly, we must recognize that our water infrastructure is actually very old. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it was actually built in the 1920s and 1940s. In Gauteng, for example, that's why when there rains, all we see is actually floods because there is no clear water encatchment system. So in that way, in fact, you could then manage. That's a third issue. I think the fourth issue is to make it sure that you introduce, for example, regulation that will allow citizens to install the tanks that will actually capture water at a household level. Because part of it, if you do that, that's what many, in fact, by the way, in rural communities, survive. So in essence, when you then get people within the suburbs and even in urban areas to encourage them, introduce that regulation. And I know, of course, one of the, just a position around this issue is how do you make it sure that you encourage citizens to develop water and catchment systems within their own homes. But at the same time, remember, you've created all these institutions like Rand Water and the others. I see in the report, there's another institution that's going to be, established, for example, that really look at a water system. But I do think that as well, the other component is that we need to actually invest in education in this country around water management. Mm-hmm. Citizens need to understand that water is a scarce resource in South Africa. It's not an infinite resource. And in essence, how we interact and manage with it, how we interact and manage the resource is actually going to be quite important. Mm-hmm. We do, for example, see sometimes in the informal communities where there's no proper spatial planning, that taps are just installed. And, sometimes they're left running for a while because there are no technicians available sometimes to come and fix it. So there are a whole lot of plethora of issues that needs to be resolved around water. And that's why I'm even nervous about this new institution, because then you start to think, if you're creating a new agency to deal with water, what's happening with the internal capacity within the department? Mm-hmm. So are you actually saying that there is no internal capacity to be able to run the new agencies? Mm-hmm. And I do think that for me, what government needs to actually do is to look at its own internal capacity and stop creating a new agency that looks at water. And if there are workers, officials that needs to be upskilled so that they can manage this, they must be able to. They must actually be able to do this. Because creation of a new institution actually signals that there is a state capacity crisis, and it seems to be ongoing, by the way, because every time there's a new institution created, it signals that people within the system are not able to deliver nor meet the new emerging demands within South African society.
In fact, when the minister did an appraisal of our water situation during Water Week, he said not only is water scarce, but the quality of the water we have is just deteriorating and doing so very fast.
I mean, that's true. But, there's actually a video that has been going around during the drought in Cape Town, though, is that there's a young journalist who went under and they discovered that there are actually water tunnels in Cape Town that are actually feeding clean water, drinkable water, straight into the sea. Now, already you can tell that. So from a planning perspective, now I'm not saying people in KZN might be confronted with the same thing, but it's possible that it's happening somewhere else. So it's clear that I think the water planning and the thinking within the public sector, there's actually an issue about understanding where those resources lie. I agree with you around the quality of the water. I mean, we do know communities in Northwest, for example, where they were without water for almost 6 months, but every time the water comes back, it's brown. They actually don't know. And obviously, the scary thing about that is that that channels actually the burden straight into public healthcare sector, because, children and community members and citizens will actually have waterborne diseases. And the reality is that obviously that's going to even put much more pressure in the public healthcare. But there needs to be an open conversation. I think civil society organizations would need to come into the party, and they're always, by the way, quite open to come and partner with government, share ideas in terms of what are the best sustainable ways of managing our water system, and how to bring in citizens as in the conversation in water management and conservation.
Lebohang, I mean, one area the government, certainly from today's presentation, is quite chuffed about is around the spectrum. They seem to be, they were quite confident that they have made a significant amount of progress. Please unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly, so I mean, I think as I was saying earlier, the whole notion of spectrum and what it actually means, it's, supposedly ostensibly to increase available spectrum. And it's of course important that the migration from analog to digital has to be completed in order for spectrum to become much more tenable. It's also linked to finalizing the policy and the policy direction on the whole use of electronic communications and various other networks and facilities, right? So, I mean, what this has done is that, the various technical innovations in information and technology and communications have really hastened and accelerated the onset of digital data and picture transmission. And it's really made us much more dependent on media. So this means that there's an overburdening on our signals, there's an overburdening on the networks in general. And digital transmission technology carries much more information today than it did perhaps even 2, 3, 4 years ago. And of course, as many of us have migrated to doing much more online work, the burden on the grid, on the digital grid, has only increased. I think the concern with this is also that the impact on socioeconomic. So what happens is that not only is the burden increased on the existing network and on the existing grid, but that those who've been excluded historically remain even more marginalized and even more dispossessed from any form of digital citizenship and digital technology. And certainly in terms of education, in terms of being able to work remotely, being able to access information, this is not a very good picture. And I think that to also add to that is that socioeconomically, we hope that, the hope and the logic is that the increase in digitization is also going to decrease the overlay that is being spent currently, the infrastructure that is being spent, and that this will then be reinvested into other things, into content production, for example, into creating spaces for creatives, artists and writers and producers to create content that is much more resonant, perhaps, with the South African experience. So this is the hope that the residue of that will then have a socioeconomic and socio-cultural benefit eventually. But it is also worth mentioning now, and I think it's worth echoing what was said earlier, that spectrum auctions are also a very huge step towards making market-based spectrum management privatized. It's a step towards privatizing the public airwaves, and it's sometimes a way, as well as being a way for the government to allocate scarce resources. And I think that certainly questions and conversations about privatization can be and are very uncomfortable. And I think also that sort of that interface between a public entity potentially being open to private ownership is extremely uncomfortable, and I think perhaps one that gives many people pause for consideration.
Pelisa, I mean, earlier I mentioned, the issue of skills, but when we were talking about Eskom, but government, of course, one of the other structural reforms that it is busy with is a visa regime that they are putting in place to attract skills and grow tourism. Just your thoughts about the progress that is being made there.
Yes, I mean, I think, as I said earlier, it is a good progress. I think, I mean, we're a country which would be open to actually, benefiting from global citizens who bring to the country, special expertise that we may not have. But I do think that at the same time is that there shouldn't be a disconnect between the skills visa system and our own skills in domestic skills intervention. So the point I was making is that, I mean, the critical skills component, I mean, has been on the table, for the last 10 years. So the key question we need to be able to ask, and I would have really liked to hear, even with this Operation Vulinhle, a reflection, and Oprah, maybe let's wait for the Minister of Education, a reflection on what type of inroads are we making through the SITA. I mean, SITA are sitting with millions and are training, young people almost on a daily basis. But of course, at the heart of everything else, it's the point I was making around the alignment between our human capital development strategy, the industrialization program, which meant to actually, build a vibrant economy, but, as well as what is actually demanded in the market. So as long as there's a polarization within those three parts, we are actually going to continue to have a whole lot of people applying for critical skills. So, for instance, yesterday I attended a migration policy discussion hosted by University of Stellenbosch, Professor Tulma Johnson. It was quite good, but there was components there where people were saying, "I've applied for a job. I bring to South Africa critical skills. I teach, economics. I have PhD in economics." I mean, you tell me that really in South Africa we don't have people that can teach economics? Now, and I think for me, we really need to also even then interrogate the private sector and even the academic institutions. How do they identify what is going to be the critical skill? Because the reality is that we do risk, through the critical skills component, we risk overlooking local talent, because ultimately, each and every country, by the way, prides itself with its own local talent. And in essence, if there's minimal investment and consistently, every time we're looking for critical skills, we have to go and get, import skills internally, but without even attaching conditions, for example, around those critical skills that would have been hired outside, and say, in the next 5 years, we want you to be shadowed by almost 3 to 4 people, as well as those should be including women, so that we don't have to see this application of a visa. Now, without that assessment, because for me, I would really like to see both Home Affairs and say, since 2014, because this was actually these critical skills, I mean, it's hailed as one of the successes, and that the last time it was developed was actually 2014. We must be able to make an assessment that between 2014 and 2022, what have we done, right? Do we still require exactly the same skills? And yes, it's possible that I looked at the list, there are certain skills that have been removed, but we know, for example, one of the skills that is classified as a critical skill here is geologists, right? So these are people that are working in the mines, etc. We have a lot of young Black people who've been posting on Twitter would say, I've just completed my master's in geology, but I'm not able to, to find a job. I'm a Black woman, I have these skills. Now, and I do think that we run also a risk of, mischievous behavior there if we actually not able to collect accurate empirical data in relation to critical skills. And we must also ask the question as well and say, who gets to identify what is a critical skill and what is not a critical skill in this country? So if we continue to work in silos between, all the critical institutions that are meant to identify, including collecting of data, we'd actually never know what is critical and what is not critical.
Lebohang, from where you sit, are we doing enough to address the skills mismatch and other problems internally?
So I think, there's a few things. The one is that we need to distinguish between the mismatch in skills and, in fact, the fact that many people are overskilled or inappropriately skilled. And there's what the market calls for, what our economy calls for, is not always what is available to it. And I do think it's slightly disingenuous at times to suggest that it's just because the skills are not available locally, but there might be more a question of whether or not they've been deployed or whether they've been recognized and so forth. The other piece of that is that in any process of integrating a skills matrix, of whether local or international employers, one also has to think about skills transfer, the transfer of these skills, and whether or not there's going to be a transitional period within which it's expected that these skills are going to be embedded in the South African economy. And this is why this needs to be embedded in other things like our ongoing industrial policy frameworks, and there are many other. There's a whole plethora of excellent policy documents and policy aspirations that we've developed in this country. And I think where perhaps the lack is in then doing the audit of what is required. What do we want this country to look like over the next 10, 15 or 20 years? And I think the short-termism is probably one of the other hindering factors that we seem to suffer with. We seem to move from one thing to the next with quite a short turnaround without the opportunity for us to assess their success or their efficacy. And another piece of that is that we also, I'm suggesting, could really look at how, again, other countries and previous experiences and previous contexts have been able to get through this. And I think one is a slightly more centralized statist approach to skills. So, for example, we keep on producing. So I'm suggesting that we are overproducing in sectors which perhaps are not as effective for our economy and are not as effective for the kind of communities that we want to build, and we're underproducing in others. And I'll close with my favorite example, which is to use India as a case study. That in 1947, when they gained their independence, they had a GDP that is far lower than what South Africa inherited in 1994, and that they made two quick decisions. The one was that they're going to focus on their arts and culture as an industry, and the other was science and technology, and that we can see 40, 50, 60, 70 years later, the dividend of two things, Bollywood, and the other is the dividend of their contributions to space, to technology, and so forth.
And that's where we're going to leave it. Let me thank both of you for your time and insights. Economists Lebohang Pheko and Phelisa Mgomo. And before we go, we must apologize for Minister Zulu's absence on the show tonight. We had indicated that she would be joining us to discuss her department's budget vote, which took place earlier today. But due to a miscommunication, we had to postpone that conversation. Minister Zulu was, however, on our sister program, The Full View, earlier, and gave assurances on the department's ability to fulfill its mandate on social relief. So again, apologies to all of you who had already posted questions and comments in anticipation of that conversation. And that's our show for tonight and for this week. Do join us again on Monday, same time. Have a great weekend.